Oh, hello. Many Magic the Gathering players ask the question, why are the Surveil lands so good? If you're a new or casual player who's asked this question, don't worry, you're not the only one. That's why I'm making this video, because you're right, it's not obvious why Surveil lands are good. They enter tapped after all, and they do look very similar to the Theros Scry lands, which haven't been premier mana fixing in quite some time. But Surveil lands are premier mana fixing. In the short time since they were introduced to the game in Murders at Karlov Manor, Surveil lands have changed the texture of Magic mana bases forever. This is no exaggeration. Surveil lands have had nearly as big an impact on Magic as Shock lands. These powerful duels see play everywhere, from standard and modern to eternal formats like Commander, Legacy, and even Vintage. It's hard to call the strength of Surveil lands a surprise precisely. Many, if not all, Magic the Gathering players identified these lands as standout cards from Murders at Karlov Manor. Modern and Commander players especially were excited that the Surveil lands had basic land types, making them tutorable with fetch lands. But while many players thought Surveil lands were going to be useful additions to formats defined by fetch lands, few recognized just how busted these lands actually were. Consider the top 8 of the 2024 Modern Regional Championship in Denver, just after Murders was released. Just 5 of the 8 players ran any Surveil lands at all in their decks, despite all 8 decks being perfect homes for Surveil lands. And even among those 5 players who did include a Surveil land in their deck, 3 of them included only 1. I'd be willing to bet if you asked those 3 players now if they should have run more than 1 Surveil land in their deck, they would say absolutely. It's rare for a card or cycle to receive as much hype as Surveil lands did during preview season and yet still turn out to have been underrated, but that's exactly what happened. So why is that? What makes these power-crept temples good enough to compete in formats with shock lands and even original dual lands? And how is it that even players who recognize their value still manage to underestimate the impact that these lands would have? In this video, I will explain everything that makes Magic the Gathering's newest busted lands cycle so powerful. I'll talk about everything from their basic traits all the way down to the subtler, more complex factors. And as we discuss why these Magic cards are so good, let us too take a moment to calmly and reasonably highlight why Microcenter is so good. Microcenter offers quality electronics at great prices, but you don't have to take my word for it.
I went to Microcenter for a new laptop computer, and they helped me decide on a Dell that was $500 off. I like Microcenter a lot.
Yes, and I saved so much on this dope PC that I was able to take my savings, invest in the stock market, and buy this dope Bugatti. Thank you, Microcenter, for making me a millionaire. Whoa, no. Stop. We can't say that. That's not true. You will not become a millionaire by shopping at Microcenter. Yes, you will. I have no financial incentive to shill for Microcenter, the only electronics store where you are cured of all disease with every purchase. So say goodbye to dysentery and hello to a Blu-ray player for only $94.99. Shopping at Microcenter will not cure you of all disease. And it also got me into the space program. I get to ride the Microcenter Micro Rocket to the moon and shop at Microcenter's lunar store. They do not own a spaceship, and they aren't opening a new store on the moon. They're opening a new store in Phoenix, Arizona. Oh, right, Phoenix. And speaking of fantasy creatures, I went into Microcenter to pick up a play booster of Final Fantasy, and when I was there, they actually anointed me with the blood of the last dragon and imbued his immortality into my earthly being. Microcenter doesn't have access to the heir to the dragon throne, Balthatog. Long may he reign. They do have great prices on Magic products, though. That one's real. You're right. I've been lying. I'm actually... It's the Shilfessor! I don't own no Bugatti, and I still have extreme dysentery. It's okay, Shilfessor. They have lots of good reasons to go in anyway. Between the sweet deals, friendly staff, and plethora of locations. And when they do, I'm sure they'll let them know Shilfessor sent them. Legally, I do have to let them know you lied about the Balthatog and the flying. That one's not a lie! The full cycle of 10 Surveil lands was printed in its entirety in Murders at Karlov Manor in February of 2024. That is incredibly recent. As of the recording of this video, just 20 months have passed since the introduction of this land cycle. And already these lands are one of Magic's premier dual land cycles, holding their own alongside fetchlands, shocklands, and yes, even original dual lands. There are a couple of layers to what makes Surveil lands good. The deeper layer is something players only started to realize once they actually played some games with them. In order to fully grasp the strength of these cards, you need to understand these layers. The first layer is what most players see when they look at these cards. Surveil lands provide three things in a neat little package: mana fixing, card selection, and basic land types. These three traits combine to overcome what is a legitimately significant downside. The Surveil lands always enter tapped. When a land enters tapped, it interferes with your ability to play spells on curve. If your land enters tapped and your opponent's does not, that puts you behind in a meaningful way, and your later turns need to be more powerful to make up for it. The combination of mana fixing, card selection, and basic land types is critical for the playability of Surveil lands. Without any one of them, these lands would not be the powerhouses that they are. How do I know this? Well, compare Surveil lands to two of their predecessors, the Theros Temples, or Scry lands, and the tapped type lands from Dominaria United. Many Magic the Gathering players compared Surveil lands to the Theros Temples when they were first previewed, and for good reason. The Temples were nearly identical to the Surveil lands, apart from missing those vital basic land types. Now, granted, surveilling is a little more powerful than scrying in most decks, as the graveyard is a more useful zone to put a card than the bottom of the deck. More cards in Magic let you access your graveyard than the bottom of your deck. The only reason you'd ever rather scry is if the card you don't want now is still a card you'll want the chance to draw later in the game. But the upside on surveilling versus scrying is not a huge difference maker. Rest assured that a cycle of identical temples with just the addition of land types would have made a similar impact on Magic mana bases as Surveil lands did. But in the timeline we actually live in, neither the Theros Temples nor the tapped type lands from Dominaria United are seeing much play these days. The Temples did see standard play in formats past and have even made their way into the mana bases of combo decks in Pioneer and Modern once upon a time. But now mana bases are simply too powerful for these lands to see play even in Standard. And as for the tapped type duels from Dominaria United, forget about it. Outside of Pauper, the primary utility for those lands are their synergy with a Sharpie, so that you can turn them into proxies of the original dual lands. No, Surveil lands needed all three. They needed to fix your mana, they needed to provide useful upside on entry, and they needed to be fetchable. Let's break down each of these traits one at a time. The first and most important is the mana fixing. Dual lands are critical for mana fixing, allowing you to run colored sources in multicolored decks without increasing the number of land types you run. Mana bases in formats with plenty of access to good lands tend to consist of upwards of 90% non-basic lands. The card selection on Surveil lands is the next most critical component. Playing a land is the most important action you can take on your turn. It's the scaling system that allows you to cast more powerful spells each turn than you played before. But while it's good to play a land even if all it does is tap for mana, it's exponentially better for you when the land you play provides some additional benefit on top of producing mana. In other words, any bonus you get from your land beyond its mana production is free upside. In the case of Surveil lands, that upside takes the form of card selection, which is a fancy phrase that means improving your draw steps. If you play a Surveil land and see a card on top of your library that you don't want to draw, and you dump that card in your graveyard, you've dug one card deeper towards something that will help you win the game. Every card you bin off a Surveil is a form of card selection. Surveil lands get even better in decks with graveyard synergies, because sometimes you'll see a card on top of your library that you actively want in your graveyard. Say, in the modern Goryo's Vengeance deck, if you surveil into an Atraxa on top of your library that you can put directly in your graveyard, that is a huge boon for you. Some competitive players cheekily refer to this phenomenon as casting an entomb, because it feels like your land has cast the powerful graveyard tutor for free. But as nice as it is to have a dual land that surveils, these two traits would not make up for the land's tapped downside if it didn't also have basic land types. In Standard, these basic land types mean your Surveil lands can turn on your Verges and other lands that care about having a certain basic land type in play. In Pioneer, these basic land types means you can search up a Surveil land if, for example, someone targets your permanent with a Boseiju. But by far, the most useful aspect of these basic land types is, of course, fetch lands. Before the advent of Surveil lands, modern players would often fetch for a tapped shock land at the end of their opponent's turn if they didn't end up needing the mana. This happened in virtually every single game of Modern that has ever been played ever. This point is key to understanding just how useful it is to be able to fetch up a Surveil land. It's not just that you can do this, it's that modern players already were doing this all the time, but without any additional benefit. Alright, let's pause a second. Everything I've said up to this point has been covering the surface of what makes Surveil lands strong. This level of understanding is what led many players to identify these lands as powerful during preview season, but many of these same players didn't fully understand just how powerful Surveil lands were. It's time for us to go a layer deeper. The reason so many players who thought Surveil lands were good still managed to underestimate them is due to a miscalculated cost-benefit analysis. In other words, players simultaneously thought the cost for running these lands was greater than it was, while also still missing just how significant the benefit was. Let's start with the cost. Tap lands are generally a non-starter these days in higher power formats, even for those that come with significant utility. Long gone are the days you could run Celestial Colonnade in your Modern deck. But there is some precedent for specifically fetchable tap lands in Modern, even in recent years. The Triomes, for example, revolutionized Modern mana bases for a few years. These lands had a huge impact in Modern, with most 3-color Modern decks running 1 copy, and 4 and 5-color decks often running as many as 2 or 3 different Triomes. In the current Modern metagame, though, the only decks that still run the Triomes are Domain Zoo, which desperately needs the land types, and the slow 4-color decks like Indomitable Creativity, and various Omnath piles that stubbornly cling to the fringes of the format. Otherwise, the Triomes have been totally supplanted by Surveil lands. The point, though, is that there remains room in Modern decks for fetchable tap lands that clear a very high bar of utility. In the case of Triomes, the utility was unparalleled mana fixing. With Surveil lands, it's that card selection. In either case, as long as the land remains in your deck, you can fetch them when it's convenient. The only problem is, sometimes you draw them. It doesn't happen often, but it can be annoying when you do. Still, even this fail case is rarely anything more than a little annoying. You just find a spot in your curve when it's least inconvenient to play them, and you still get your Surveil when you do. So yeah, it's not ideal to have a tap land in your deck, but it's usually not game-losing either. On the other hand, the upside of having a fetchable Surveil land somewhere in your deck really can be game-winning. It's hard to overstate this. Say you have 8 fetch lands in your deck plus 1 Surveil land. That means you have 9 copies of your Surveil land, not just 1. For the cost of putting 1 card in your deck that you'd rather not draw, you can have 8 other copies of a card in your deck that get exponentially better when you draw them, when that 1 card you don't want to draw is still somewhere in your deck. In other words, with 8 fetches and 1 Surveil land in your deck, you are 8 times more likely to draw one of the cards that make the Surveil land awesome than you are to draw the 1 card that makes the Surveil land awkward, by which I mean the Surveil land itself. Now, keep in mind this analysis is only relevant while the Surveil land is still in your deck and able to be either drawn or fetched for. Once you grab your Surveil land with your fetch lands, 2 things happen, 1 good and 1 bad. The good news is you guarantee you can no longer draw the card you didn't want to draw. The bad news is you can no longer fetch for it either. Your fetch lands go back to being normal fetch lands. This good news and bad news puts you right back where you started before you included any fetch lands in your deck. That is, you can't draw what's not in your deck, but you also can't fetch for what's not in your deck. And thus, a similar cost-benefit question is raised with regard to the second Surveil land. Does the ability to fetch for a second Surveil land outweigh the increased chance you naturally draw that card? As it turns out, in the case of many modern decks, the answer to that question is a resounding yes. The vast majority of modern decks that run any Surveil lands at all run at least 2, and some modern decks run as many as 3 or even 4. The biggest drawback to drawing your Surveil land, as it turns out, is not that at some point you have to find a window to play out a tap land. It's that drawing your Surveil land takes that Surveil land out of your deck before you were ready to fetch for it. By running multiple copies of Surveil lands, you mitigate this drawback considerably, as you're much less likely to draw multiple Surveil lands than you are to draw just one. I mentioned at the start of this video that Surveil lands see play in Legacy, a format where tap lands were nearly unheard of before Murders at Karlov Manor. The format is too fast and mana efficient to justify including a tap land in your deck, and that's made doubly true because of the existence of Waste Land, which can destroy a tap land before you ever get to use it. And yet, the ability to turn your fetch lands into card selection when you need a good top deck is so obscenely powerful that everything from tempo decks to combo decks to control decks run a copy of their on-color Surveil land. Perhaps the biggest reason Surveil lands are great in Legacy is the card Brainstorm, a card which makes all tutor targets better. If you draw your Surveil land, simply keep it in your hand. When you put it back on top of your library, you can then shuffle it away with a fetch land. Maybe that shuffle land you used to shuffle it away will even go fetch it back up. Surveil lands are even more powerful in Commander than they are in any other format for the simple fact that your deck size is bigger, so you're less likely to draw a Surveil land than you are in a 60-card constructed format. The format where Surveil lands have had the least impact is actually Pioneer. In Pioneer, it doesn't really matter that Surveil lands are fetchable, apart from that iteration with Boseiju I mentioned earlier. In the Pioneer format, Surveil lands are not much different than temples, and as such, they only see play in decks that were already willing to run tap lands even before Surveil lands showed up. In other words, control decks and Lotus Field. In every other deck, even graveyard-centric decks like Phoenix and Greasefang, the downside of entering tapped looms large. Too large. This would likely be true in Standard as well if Standard had access to more dual lands. The color combinations with plenty of dual lands to work with tend not to run any Surveil lands. Dimir Midrange, for instance, which has a lot of great non-basics to run, does not run any copies of Undercity Sewers. The dramatically reduced playability of Surveil lands in Pioneer, and to a lesser extent Standard, is further evidence for the importance of the interplay between Surveil lands and fetch lands. In a sense, Surveil lands are good because of how much better they make fetch lands. This is a key distinction between shock lands and Surveil lands. Shock lands do make fetch lands better, as fetch lands need to be able to fetch dual lands in order to unlock their full potential. But shock lands are still premier mana fixers, even in formats without fetch lands, as evidenced by their ubiquity in both Pioneer and Standard right now. Surveil lands do have some utility in these fetchless formats, but the vast majority of their strength lies in the power boost that they give fetch lands, giving every fetch land the option of being either an untapped shock land, a painless untapped basic, or a tapped dual that fixes your draw step is a ridiculous upgrade to give what was already Magic the Gathering's most powerful land cycle. Now, to understand why I call fetch lands Magic's most powerful land cycle, check out my video here where I explain what makes these lands so good. Keep in mind that I made this video before Surveil lands were a thing. They were already so good before Surveil lands that they warranted a whole video about how busted they are. And now that we have Surveil lands, just look at these things. Disgusting. Filthy. I hope you're proud of yourself, fetch lands. In the 20 months since Surveil lands entered Magic, they have firmly established themselves as the upper echelon of mana fixers, alongside longtime heavyweights like shock lands and fetches. These lands are so good that they see play in decks that abhor tap lands, like aggro decks and blisteringly fast combo decks. They're so good that they see play even in the highest power formats like Legacy, Vintage, and CEDH. It's hard to imagine anything supplanting Surveil lands for a very long time, at least until Wizards of the Coast prints, I don't know, a typed tap land that draws a card when it enters? Yeah, no time soon. So until that time, I hope very much this video has been of some help to you. Remember, if you'd like to know what makes fetch lands or shock lands so good, you can check out those videos in our series Here and Here. And if you'd just like to see this great game played, be sure to catch the newest episode of Shuffle Up and Play, all of which is linked in this video's description. Whoa, and remember, there's less than 1 week left to pick up your limited edition TCC redesigned logo t-shirts, pins, stickers, hoodies, and even beanies. You can pick all this up at tcc.store, but you've only got about a week left if you want to get some of this sweet TCC swag.
Next time on Shuffle Up and Play.
What's up? It's Shuffle Up and Play, and today we have balanced our decks against a medium deck.
Mid? Did they call it? I think the kids call it mid.
But okay, off.
Your deck was bonkers crazy powerful.
They replaced a couple cards.
And how many was that?
20? I have a really easy turn 1, a Gloom Lake Verge land.
Drop return.
And then I'm gonna drop return.
This is what I assume your lives are usually like. As influencers.
You're an influencer.
You're an influencer.
I want to tell you this. That's what you do.
Death Cap Glade.
Is that a no cap? What's it's cap? Yeah, cap. Cap.
I want to attack, but I don't think anybody's naked. You got a 4/4 froggy.
Can't be naked.
What? Is this a common vibe?
Sometimes I say things and I don't know why.